This is lesson 244 in the Yellow River Valley Civilization. And here is a picture of the Huanghe River Valley Civilization. And this is actually the Zhou Dynasty. But the inset right here is the one that came before it, and the one we'll talk about much more than the Zhou Dynasty, which is the Shang Dynasty. A couple of words that we need to get straight in our minds. One is the Huanghe River, also known as the Yellow River. And it was in this valley that you had a river civilization in China. Also, the word dynasty. What is a dynasty? We're going to figure that one out. And what, in particular, the Shang Dynasty. What are characters? What is ancestor worship? And how do the Chinese use bronze and silk? And what is millet? So the Huanghe River Civilization, or the Yellow River Civilization, of the four river valley civilizations, this is the only one that has stayed in existence continuously right up to today. It's the only river valley civilization that is still around in 2020. The river is called the Yellow River because of the yellow silt that it leaves behind when it floods. People started building cities along this river about 4,000 years ago. Chinese dynasty. A dynasty is when a country has a sequence of successive hereditary rulers that come from the same ruling family. In other words, you've got a king, his son becomes the next king, and his son becomes the next king, and so on. China has had numerous ruling dynasties throughout its history. Some have been very long, lasted for centuries, and some have lasted only a few years. And to this day, the Chinese mark their history and the events in their history by their dynasties. In other words, the significance of an event is in the dynasty in which it took place. The first real dynasty in China that we know of was the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty lasted about 600 years, from about 1700 to about 1027 BCE. The Shang Dynasty had a total of 30 emperors throughout 17 generations. And the Shang, and this is why we know of them first, were the first to leave written records. And you can see on this map the Shang Dynasty, and you can see it's not nearly as large as modern China is today. The Shang Dynasty built cities like Anyang, and Anyang was an important capital. One of the things that made it unique from the other river valley civilizations is that this capital was built mainly out of wood. There's lots of timber available, and you didn't have timber available in, let's say, the Nile or Mesopotamia like you have in China. So that's why in Mesopotamia they tend to be made out of brick or stone. The Shang Dynasty. Social classes in ancient China were sharply defined. You had nobles and you had peasants. And Shang Dynasty China was governed by a noble warrior class. They were nobles. That was headed by a king, and the king is also a noble. Noble families owned the land that the peasants worked. Family structure in Shang China. Remember that the society was a patriarchal society. Men ruled the family and made the important decisions. Respect for one's parents was a high virtue. Women in the Shang Dynasty were second-class citizens. They were expected to obey their husbands, their fathers, and even their sons. The Shang religion. The ancient Chinese believed that the spirits of their family ancestors could bring either good fortune or disaster to a living family. And they believed that the spirits of a family's ancestors demanded attention and respect. Now, the Shang believed in many gods. They believed that you consulted the gods through the spirits of your ancestors. Shang writing. We've seen writing on other media like clay tablets and papyrus. And the piece of writing on this particular picture is written into bone. The ancient Chinese developed a system of pictographs, which we call characters, each of which represented a thing or a concept. There was no relationship between what word a character meant and what the word actually sounded like. And there was advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantage is that anybody could communicate regardless of their spoken dialect. You could learn to read Chinese very well without ever learning to speak a word of it. But it also had a disadvantage. The reader had to memorize literally thousands and thousands of characters. Shang art. The ancient Chinese were highly skilled in making bronze objects, such as weapons and vessels. And the Shang were also the first to make textiles out of silk. The fall of the Shang Dynasty. Around 1027 BC, a people called the Zhou, you could also say Zhao if you wanted to, overthrew the Shang and set up their own dynasty. And the Zhou adopted much of Shang culture.